So, hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for stopping by again today. I have another exciting interview for you. Today, we're talking to Canadian Member of Parliament, Nikki Ashton. She's from the New Democratic Party. We're going to be talking her alliance with Bernie Sanders and progressives from all over the world to form Progressive International. And we're also going to be talking about, the George Floyd protests and how the issue of racial justice and injustice is playing a part on both sides of the border in Canada and the USA. So Nikki, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much, Christo, for having me. I'm a fan of your show, and it's a real pleasure to well, I've been a fan of yours for a long time, so it's a real pleasure to be with you here to talk about these critical issues and the moment of in time that we live in.
Yeah, certainly. So Nikki, talk a bit about Progressive International, because I know it kind of got a lot of attention, I believe, last year. But, with the presidential primaries, it sort of took a back seat, but it's good to see it back again. So remind people like what it is and what the broad goals are.
Mm-hmm. Well, Progressive International is a network of progressive activists, elected folks, academics, people that that have come together with the hopes of building a progressive movement, organizing progressives around the world, mobilizing, and learning from each other, on how we can take on the big challenges of our time, whether it's racial injustice, whether it's growing inequality, whether it's the climate emergency that we all face. And as you pointed out, it was kicked off in December 2018 at a gathering in Vermont hosted by the Sanders Institute and the DM25, the European political movement, and the Sanders Institute came together to create this launch, and I was deeply honored to be able to be there, standing alongside Bernie Sanders, Yanis Varoufakis, and many others, in saying that now is the time. Look, we know that the right learns from each other. We know that right-wing think tanks are constantly doing their work of forcing their agenda on people around the world of pursuing their interests,
Yes,
corporate-driven interests. And so really this is about the left and progressives coming together. And I think that it was also really important that it be brought back now during the COVID-19 crisis, a crisis that has really shone the light on the way in which right-wing ideologies, austerity, privatization has rendered us all more vulnerable.
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, whether it's the United States where their healthcare issues are endemic, but even here in Canada, we have the scourge of healthcare being linked to employment status, maybe not fully, but at least for core things like dental care and pharmacare. And we have Canadians by the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, at risk of losing access to that care, in addition to the Canadians that never had it in the first place. I think it's really interesting, and I think one thing that I hope to see from Progressive International is, like, as you know, the right is unified with think tanks, but also with like a media message. And I think what we've seen in Britain with Jeremy Corbyn, and in the United States with Bernie Sanders, and even in Canada with Jagmeet Singh, is a systematic hostility from the media. And I'm wondering if Progressive International is looking at building, whether through official or independent sources, a left-wing media apparatus.
Well, I think that's definitely part of the goal, and I know right now they're talking a lot about sharing a policy vision, and you're right. Part of the way we need to do that is getting a message out there, and pursuing independent media, alternative media, using all the tools we have to have these critical discussions. And I will say that. I think again, what this crisis has proven is the extent to which, we know that a different world has to be possible. We know that that the status quo, the neoliberal status quo, has led to hundreds of thousands of deaths now around the world, and of course the U.S. is an awful example of that. But it's not a guarantee that progressive ideas will carry the day, because the right the corporate elite to the political elite are certainly keen to double down on their interests. And we're seeing that happen in the US right now. And so, the need for us to break through and hear each other out, connect with each other, and get our message out is critical. And I encourage all of your listeners and viewers to head on to the Progressive International website. You can join as a member. You can get the updates there. And there's some really incredible visionary pieces already there around, tenant mobilization against predatory landlords. There's, about, they talk about international Green New Deal. There's talk about justice for Palestine in the days that we live in right now. And so, there's so much there, and this is only the beginning. And I believe that, we can take this in a lot of directions. But again, the current crisis has pointed to the desperate need for us to come together as progressives and build our movement globally, but also locally as well.
Yeah, certainly. And I think one thing that I'm interested to see is, and it sort of relates to your critic portfolio and Nikki's critic portfolio. At least one of them is dedicated to fighting privatization and to reimagining and reinvigorating public ownership. And I'm wondering if, there's that's often been wedded to a sort of nationalism, in Canadian history. But I'm wondering if we can find an internationalist vision for public and cooperative and worker ownership. And I'm wondering if that's something you've been looking at to have Canadian ownership of Canadian industries, but, by Canadians, but also with an internationalist vision.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that we've seen in recent years a real movement emerge in Europe around a public ownership, around worker cooperatives. I mean, there's always been an element of that, but certainly the crisis, in the European South, in Greece, for example, a country that we're both connected to, in Spain and in Northern Europe, there's been a real push, including at the municipal level, for public ownership of services, and there's been a lot of movement there, and I think in North America we need to get on that boat. We need to really take a hard look at the way in which privatization and austerity has contributed to the growing inequality that's hurting all of us. That's led to the rise of precarious work for our generation. That's meant that so many of our services and our production has is out of our hands and being taken care of by people who are solely looking at their own corporate profit margins. And I think again this crisis has really shone a very bright and unflattering light on how privatization has hurt us. Canada has a very shameful reputation now as being, I believe, still the worst country in the world for deaths in long-term care. Our elderly have died at a very high rate because many of them are stuck in for-profit long-term care homes rather than publicly owned care homes that again could be part of our healthcare system, which of course is public. But I'll also say, in terms of production, and that's a controversial topic for many, but as democratic socialists, we believe that that government, that the state, and that there should be collective ownership of our means of production. And I think the lack of access to personal protective equipment. I mean, why can we not produce what we need? And I believe that this crisis that has left us truly unprepared really points to the fact that we need to be producing PPE, that we need to be producing ventilators, that we need to be producing critical goods that that are necessary to keep us safe. And then the other piece I would say, and I'm transport critic as well for the NDP, is the clamor for bailouts and business as usual from corporations.
Yes.
I mean, they haven't gotten bailouts as such here in Canada, but they've received a lot of public funds through the wage subsidy program, the loan program that's available to them. And I'm sorry, we need to be saying any public funds should be tied to equity stake
Yeah. Yeah.
for the Canadian people. And
Yeah.
I mean, you have people like Angela Merkel, not a progressive,
No.
that's pushed for this for their own national airline.
Yeah.
And here in Canada, our Air Canada CEO, took a pay cut to now 5.3 million.
Yeah. Yeah.
As a show of solidarity. Like, give me a break, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we need to be putting forward a much bolder vision, and a vision that frankly makes sense, when it comes to the public interest of Canadians. Let's learn from our mistakes, and let's do things differently to lift people up.
Yeah, no, certainly. I think that's a really important factor, right? To look at, democratizing spaces of life that are currently, especially if you're in a non-unionized workplace, but even if you are in many cases, that are basically autocratic. I mean, I think this brings us to some of the current news, because one thing we've realized, or we should be realizing, is that, the struggle for racial justice, again, is an international struggle. It's a global struggle. And what we've been seeing, is obviously a lot of focus, and not without reason, on the United States, on Minneapolis with George Floyd. But in the past week plus in Canada, there's been a series of incidents that have raised the same concerns, I feel, that what we've seen with Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and others. And I'm wondering if you want to speak to some of those things.
Absolutely. Well, first, I want to say that many of us in Canada have been, extremely shocked by the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police. Many of us have expressed solidarity from the get-go with so many who are rising up, whether it's, members of the Black community, whether it's, allies in the struggle against anti-Black racism and for systemic change, and for many of us, certainly as progressives here in Canada, we've been deeply inspired by movements like the Black Lives Matter movement that, of course, originated in the U.S., but we know is also very much alive here in Canada. But I will say, so many activists, BLM activists, and others here in our own country have made the very clear connection between, racial injustice and police violence against the Black community and the Indigenous
Yes.
community here in our country. And, it's all been driven home by the fact that just yesterday morning,
Yeah.
a young Indigenous woman, 26-year-old woman, Chantal Moore, originally from British Columbia, recently moved to New Brunswick, and at 2:30 a.m. on Thursday morning, the cops were sent to her house, asked to go and do a wellness check
Yes.
on
Yes.
her. There was some concern around mental health and her fears of being harassed by somebody. And on this wellness check, she was killed by a
Yeah.
police officer, shot to death. This is Canada. This
Yeah.
is 2020. This is in the midst of the uprising against the injustice of George Floyd's death. So it very much that same injustice exists here in our country, and it's the systemic racism extends to the media coverage, right? And I did a tweet just a short while ago, right? That the number one newspaper in the province of New Brunswick,
Yeah.
did not. This was not the number one story. The murder of this young Indigenous woman was not the number one story. Right off to the side, there was the same sort of garbage of there was a reference to an altercation with police, not a murder by police, not a
Officer
reference.
involved, they'll say. You know what I mean? That sort of Klobucharian language. Yeah.
That's a good way
Yeah.
of putting it.
Yeah.
And they couldn't even say her name, right? Chantal Moore, say her name. And
Yeah.
so I think I think but I will say that many have shown incredible support. But guess who we haven't heard from yet in any meaningful way is our federal government,
Yeah.
right? And we have a prime minister who has his own sordid racist story.
Yeah.
We know about blackface that came out in the election, but on terms of the priorities of the Indigenous community, just a few days ago, his government came up with a lame excuse of not being able to act on the historic inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women, and said, no, we can't come up with an action plan because of COVID. Just a few short days later, another Indigenous woman was killed, and this time by police. And so, we in Canada, many like to say, well, we support what's happening in the U.S., or our heart goes out to what's happening to those that are fighting for justice in the U.S., and we need to take a hard look at those exact same systemic injustices happening right now here in our own country. We need to see national leadership. We need to see Justin Trudeau stand up to Donald Trump, and not a 21-second pause followed by a bunch of a word salad, as some might say, that conveyed nothing. We need to denounce the kind of tyranny that we're seeing from Donald Trump, and we need to get serious about the same kind of injustice happening here in our own country.
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, that was just one of the stories. There was another story in Canada's north, in Nunavut, one of our northern territories, where an Indigenous person was hit by a federal Royal Canadian Mounted Police RCMP vehicle, and then a few days before that, around the same time of George Floyd, an Indigenous woman was basically thrown off a balcony during an altercation with police in the heart of the Greater Toronto area, and nothing's been done about any of these things, and it's been a week. This is 1 week. I mean, these things happen all the time, and as Nikki knows, as a member of Parliament from Manitoba, there's also been, in the last few weeks, there's been a rash of young Indigenous people whose lives have been taken by police.
Here in my own province.
In Winnipeg and what have you.
In April, 3 Indigenous people, including a 16-year-old young woman, Aisha Hudson, were killed by police, and there's been so little that's come out of it, and I do think, I will say, I think what we have right now is a moment in time here in our own country, to learn from what's happening in the States, and the very clear calls for systemic change. And one of those really important calls is the one around defunding the police, right? I mean, let me just use the example here in my own province. I'm up north, but our capital city, Winnipeg, the Winnipeg City Police killed these 3 Indigenous people in April, it's a city with a huge racism problem, real marginalization of Indigenous peoples. Poverty, is off the charts for Indigenous peoples in Winnipeg, and meanwhile you have the Winnipeg City Police that has a tank, which they refer to as a rescue vehicle.
They do not like it being their tank being called a tank. No, they're very unhappy when you do that. Yeah,
right, exactly. I mean, and thankfully, the Twitter sphere took them to task when they defended their use of their language and denying that they have a tank. But I mean, this is ridiculous. Like, and I think this discussion around defunding the police, and I would say also disarming is really critical in terms of dealing with the systemic racism, the systemic discrimination that exists within the force, and we know issues around sexual violence as well, and the complicity of the policing system when it comes to women and survivors not seeing justice. And so this is a moment in time where calls for defunding need to be heard here at home, and I'm certainly in favor of us implementing those calls and saying, like, wait a second, let's not think we're any different from the U.S. Let's see how we can deal with the systemic nature and put an end to this shocking, and horrific police violence aimed at Indigenous and Black people of color here in our country.
No, certainly. I think it's such an interesting time because a lot of these things have been known by Indigenous people, by Black people, and some of their stronger allies. But I think now, as within the United States, it's for all to see. And I think you're seeing radical transformations in what was seen as politically possible in terms of cutting police budgets, reallocating that money to social services aimed specifically at marginalized people, but also just in general. More libraries, less jails, more childcare, less jails, wellness checks done by people that aren't police with guns, but well-trained social servants, social service workers and what have you. And these are all things that I think are rapidly growing in popularity. And I think that this is it's just the start, really, because we have to talk about the prison system here in Canada. The level of disproportionality in terms of Indigenous people in prison is even higher than African Americans in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So this image of Canada as this racial paradise, whether it's police violence or whether it's the violence of incarceration, is
or poverty,
woefully racialized, right? It's racialized, right?
Yeah.
100%. And it's obviously class based. And I think that it's important we hear from our prime minister, because he has failed not only at calling out Donald Trump, and we all saw, I think by now, the Al Sharpton jab at him that it shouldn't take 21 seconds to condemn racism, but even on our own policies. And I think Jagmeet Singh made a great point, which is that the leader of our party, I'm a member of the party as well. My viewers know this, but the leader of our party basically said, look, when I was a child, he's the first racialized person to lead a major federal party in Canada, said, look, when I was a child, there were people that bullied me, and many people who didn't bully me nonetheless stood by and watched as it happened. And that's Justin Trudeau right now. And if you hark back to some of the famous quotes from people like Martin Luther King, it's, the white moderates are the biggest fear. And frankly, it's, that you'll remember the silence of your friends in some ways more than the slurs of your enemies. Mm-hmm. And I think that our national leadership of Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party have utterly failed Canadians, and they failed, marginalized people the world over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I had the opportunity to share those exact words of Martin Luther King in the House yesterday when I did a statement about the importance of us not being silent, in terms of the injustice happening in the States, the tyranny, and I think we have to call it out for what it is. I mean, Donald Trump is a racist. Yes. He is a fascist. Yeah. The threat or the directive to bring in the military against the American people. I mean, the images of the police, beating people. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that the U.S. uses against other countries to push regime change.
Yeah, they've launched coups over far less than what we're seeing.
Exactly. And as many have said, it's this isn't different to what it used to be. It's just now that it's being taped, right? And I think again, we have a moment in time, including here in our own country, and especially in our own country as Canadians ourselves, to say enough. Like the racial injustice and the poverty, the violence of, you pointed out, from the police, from the justice system, violence of poverty, yes. Right? I mean, it's it's shocking, right? And I represent part of the country that I'm from here in northern Manitoba, and a lot of especially men that I went to school with ended up going into the justice system, because they are Indigenous, because of where they grew up, and as member of Parliament, I'll never forget going house to house in an isolated First Nation here in our region, and I remember asking the guy that lived in the house, if he was planning on voting in the upcoming federal election. And he said, he probably would if he was still around, but he probably won't be because he's going to be back in jail. And I was shocked that he was so upfront about that. And the very clear reason he gave me is because he had no place to live in his community, that he was basically couch surfing, and in the absence of a safe home, and we know that that's a huge issue in many First Nations across the country, the lack of housing. For him, the option was going back into jail, right? And this is shocking. A country as wealthy as Canada, right? And this is this is the story, of the violence, the continued, ongoing, daily violence perpetrated against Indigenous people here in our country, and a violence that that certainly supports is innate to a broader system where many who are powerful are benefiting from it. So I think, and I'll say, Bernie Sanders has also been very clear about the extent to which the corporate elites have benefited from the status quo that involves racial injustice, right? And really taking on the need for system change to include taking on the billionaires, taking on the wealthy. And I think that's something critical in our own country. While you have Trudeau, who again, part of the problem when it comes to racial injustice is also very much reinforcing the corporate status quo, even during this crisis, right? Major contracts are going to companies like Amazon instead of our own public postal service, right? The extent to which the private sector has benefited from public funds, without any sort of, again, ownership, equity stake, anything being contingent on benefiting working people or Canadians more broadly, is just shocking. And that's, as we re-envision a new world, and that's something that Progressive International talks about. Let's talk about a world where there is racial justice, where there is social justice, economic justice, and of course environmental justice, which we know is tied into all of this as well.
Excellent. No, I think that's 100% on point, and I think that whether it's the Canadian NDP or whether it's the Progressive International, that I'm glad to see these things coming together. Nikki, before we wrap up, let me know, or let the audience know, where people can find you on the internet. I believe you have a YouTube channel, but you also have Facebook, Twitter. Let people know where they can find you.
Yes, we have it all. So definitely pretty active on Twitter. So please feel free to check us out there. And at Nikki Ashton is my handle. We're on Facebook. I have the politician page and the personal page. It all blends. So please feel free to check those out and reach out that way as well. I am on Instagram, but as a dad yourself, Christo, you'd appreciate probably the fact that we do need some spaces to share some pictures of our kids.
Yeah.
So my Instagram is a mix of politics and cute twin pictures, because as the mom of twins, there's a lot of those, and a number of those that involve twins in being brought into protests, political action, and that's how it is in our home. But folks can tune in there, and I really encourage people to check out Progressive International, sign up as a member. I know there's talk of a gathering being organized in Iceland. Obviously, with COVID, we don't know the exact timeline. There was some hopes that it could be, later on in the fall, but I think that might be on hold. But again, this is we have an incredible opportunity with Progressive International to connect. But I think the moment that we're living in, the tragic murder of George Floyd, the murder of Chantel Moore, the struggle against racial injustice that is raging and changing our world right now, is something that we need to keep supporting, keep propelling, and obviously through international solidarity, but also solidarity here at home. And I know you have obviously very many Canadian viewers, and I'm just really inspired by the mobilization right now, and let's keep it up. Let's keep pushing for system change, and let's keep our eye on that ultimate pursuit of justice that we all deserve.
Excellent. Nikki, thank you so much for joining us. Have a good one. Stay safe, and always happy to have you again.
Thanks so much, Crystal. Thanks for everything you're doing to connect all of us and push us all the way we need to be pushed. And to you and to all your viewers, please take care.